Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. It's a wonderful book, and we have two very smart people. So I will kick off to both of you. To paraphrase Tolstoy, are rich countries alike or are poor countries alike? Do we know why countries are poor or do we know why countries are rich?
I think, let me take a stab at that. Because failure is overdetermined uh, and success requires a lot to go right, therefore, poor countries are more likely to be similar than rich countries. Because failure is overdetermined, all kinds of things go wrong, and one can explain poverty and low income standards. And successes are successful in very different ways. But to bring it back to the book, I think we have a chapter on India's, which is about the states. But what we find, what is the kind of the beauty and the magic of India, is that we find both commonalities in the failures and successes, but also distinctiveness about them. And that's why we say the Anna Karenina quote about happy families alike, etc., that both the successes and failures have patterns and have exceptions, which is what makes it so fascinating, the study of. So you were talking about countries, but you can bring it back down to India, the states themselves, and say, your question is valid, but what happens in India is that both the failures and successes, there are patterns. For example, is that one pattern for the successes is that the more globalized states are the ones that succeeded. But they succeeded in different ways because, Tamil Nadu and Gujarat succeeded by being globalized to manufacturing, Karnataka via Bangalore through services, and the most unique development model of all, which neither does agriculture, nor does manufacturing, nor does IT services, but has been successful in Kerala, but it's also globalized via labor flows.
Do you agree Bimaru states are more likely to be similar than in Karnataka and Maharashtra or the Gujarat or Tamil Nadu, which are successful states by purely economic criteria, are unique in their ways?
Yes,
Just put his mic on, please. It's on now.
yeah, you do see common patterns across, if you want to call it, the Hindi belt. Whether you see it in human capital, whether you see it in law and order, whether you see it in governance, more broadly defined. You also see it in low agricultural yields, because these are agricultural states, and any development path lies through first raising agricultural productivity. That, as we know, the spread of the Green Revolution to central eastern India was more gradual. It has occurred, but it was far more gradual. So that base was weaker, which allowed other states to propel themselves. And the parallel investments in human capital in particular were much, much weaker.
Okay. So is your book about economics or politics? It's, you have to, Woody Allen used to say the advantage of being bisexual is you double your chances of finding a date. So you have clearly succeeded in confusing a lot of people on, and can they be separated? Should we separate them? Are they less connected than we thought because of China? So it's a broader, serious question about, we thought mass prosperity and mass democracy were twins, siblings, cousins, whatever. And a lot of the world is saying, well, maybe they're not connected. So is it a book about economics and politics, and how do you separate them?
Yeah, firstly, we absolutely, adamantly, vehemently resist that binary. For the following reason. And in fact, the reason why we do that, and kind of one of the raison d'etre of the book, is that, we started, so I'm an economist, economists, development is about states versus markets. I'm generalizing. Political scientists say, oh, politics is key to determining all outcomes, etc. But we absolutely are convinced of the view that development, especially for a fledgling nation like India in 1947, is about at least four things. Is about how do you convert a colonial state into a development state? So the state is a question. Two, how do you build a nation, especially as complicated and diverse and large as India? And so forging a sense of nationhood, another key element. Three, how do you create markets, which is a thing. And fourth, absolutely, which was something that the founding fathers wanted, was actually to transform society, not take society as given. And then, again, coming it back to India, all this has to be done through universal franchise-based democratic politics from day one, which no other country adopted. So that, and so to bring it back to us, so given that we had this broader conception of development, Devesh is a political scientist and, of course, done lots of interesting stuff on many dimensions. I'm a kind of economist. So that view and that belief lent itself to us cooperating and writing this much. So bottom line, we resist your binary.
But you want to answer the question? I mean, India created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. Political scientists might say that it's harder to create a democracy than to create an economy. Economy is about plumbing, and economists are not as interesting as political scientists. So it's more complicated in political science, right? So why haven't we created mass prosperity when we created mass democracy? And why has the theory that as China becomes more prosperous, it will become more democratic? I mean, it's becoming less democratic as it becomes prosperous. So you must be thinking about that sort of issue.
No, so I think there's no doubt that India stands out across countries in the degree to which it became the democratic without achieving commensurate prosperity. But I think part of the reason which we analyze in the book is that actually asking the question, and we use the term precocious to democracy, precocious in the sense of something that is unusually ahead of its time, right? When you say a precocious child, we say that she is, smarter than her age would otherwise seem to be. And what the book tries to show is that, the extremely low levels of per capita income, extremely low levels of urbanization, extremely low levels of literacy, when you have that, it then forces the state to take choices which might not have been taken if you did not have the democracy. For instance, we tried to build a welfare state before providing public goods. Public goods, primary education, public health. In fact, today the evidence is quite strong that the spread of primary education around the world occurred in countries before they achieved universal franchise. So that the push towards redistribution in particular is much greater when you have universal franchise. So one consequence of this was that by not having a strong foundation of public goods, that then has consequences for your quality of your workforce and a whole lot of other things.
So we couldn't be a precocious economy because we chose mass franchise? I mean, universal franchise? When you say we're a precocious democracy, we couldn't have been a precocious economy because we chose universal franchise?
So two things. I mean, firstly, your statement that I'm going to take issue with your statement that it's easy to create good prosperity than it is to sustain democracy. that may or may not be true in a relative sense, but creating prosperity cross country is fiendishly hard because there are very few rich countries around the world. So it may be relative, and in the Indian case, therefore, creating the prosperity was at least, may not be aggravated or made more difficult, but certainly democracy played a role in that. But coming to your question on this, so when we talk about precociousness, there's a political dimension to it. But there's also an economic dimension to it, right? The economic dimension, everyone knows, for example, India went from, typically countries go from, to try and be as alliterative and clever as Manish, to go from farm to factory to pharma, right? But India bypassed that and kind of has gone from farm to, software, et cetera, et cetera. Now, was that because of democracy? I think certainly we would argue in the book that actually that itself had nothing to do with precocious democracy. For example, just to give an example, we made many early choices on the economy that reflected broadly the intellectual zeitgeist of the time. But we also did this thing called industrial licensing, which, nothing about either precocious democracy or about the intellectual zeitgeist required to make that choice. And that choice partly led to this, kind of the manufacturing. There are many other factors, but that's, for example, one example of how, the precocious economy was not a derivative of precocious politics, and not even, a derivative of some socialist ideology, as it were.
Actually, if I can add, see, I think you're posing this binary between politics and economics. But in the book, as Arvind started off, we forget that there was another key goal, which is to build a nation. Unlike most other countries, the quintessential Western experience, where nation building was built on a single language and a single religion, that option was not available, taken in India. Democracy was the key instrument of nation building, and India is unique in that respect. And that has had many, many positive consequences that we show in the book. We completely underestimate. Above all, it provided order. We show in the book that in the process of nation building, India has had the least amount of mass violence among countries in the world. I mean, take the US. In the process of nation building, they have a civil war. 2% of the population is killed. If 2% of the population in India is killed, that's 30 million people, right? So look at our neighbors, which tried that one religion, one language. So you can look at the former Soviet Union, you can look at Yugoslavia, you can look at the violence, the breakup almost in Nigeria, Sudan. We forget how much, while there, even if there was a trade-off, the fact that it helped forge a nation is something we should not undervalue.
No, but so are you saying that we may be fifth in total GDP, but we're 120th in per capita GDP? Is that because of choice or circumstance or democracy?
I mean,
is it an opening balance? It was so wounded, but there's an expiry date on blaming the British for our poverty, right? So yeah. Wasn't it just choice, circumstance, or was it democracy?
I mean,
128th.
Yeah, exactly. So I think certainly it was a result of choices that we made. Some were related to precocious democracy. Let's not get away from that. To give you one example, that early on, most successful economies of today, especially the East Asians, did fundamental land reform as a precursor for agricultural productivity growth, yield growth, which in turn led to demand for low-skill manufacturing, which then led to the exporting of low-skill manufacturing, and so on. In India, in the early years, the fact is we did some land reform, but the real serious land reform we couldn't do because, not just because of democracy, but the particular way in which the Congress party, especially at the local level, was beholden to landed interests and therefore stymied that. And that, I think
you call it a hidden debt. That was a wonderful
yeah,
expression.
that's from Mahatma Gandhi, actually.
Okay.
And so, or the other way we put it is that, to kind of summarize the two, the democracy and the order things, there's a line in the book where we say, if the price of democracy is the absence of revolution, the pricelessness of democracy is also the averting of social disorder.
Okay. You can repeat that afterwards for others. I mean, is reform in 1991, was it out of compulsion or conviction? Does India ever reform out of conviction, or in a democracy, this conviction like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan? I don't think they made the state smaller, but there's a notion that India doesn't change for a better option. She changes when you have no option. What do you think as a political scientist? Was 1991 conviction or compulsion?
The question is, conviction amongst who?
No, so I'm asking you. I mean,
I
reform
mean,
is always done by
I
reformers.
Yeah, so the reformers clearly had a conviction. In fact, we know and we show in the book that much of the work towards reforms was being steadily done through the 80s.
Okay.
So the groundwork had been laid. You cannot just, today there's a crisis and you cannot have that package of reforms just done in 24 hours. The work had all been done, but the political opening was lacking. That needed a crisis.
Yeah, and there's a subtle thing about the 91 reform. There's, I think, a subtle third factor, which is that in the 60s and 70s, people would say, or 70s and 80s, reform, look at the East Asian tigers. And, the kind of, the Indian mentality was, small countries, we're a big country. But then when China happened, I think so it was a compulsion from the crisis, conviction, as Devesh said, but also the fact that you can no longer say that, large countries cannot do reform, and China provided that, I think, powerful example, because, I think some famously, someone said, now China is doing it, but why can't we? So I think all three contributed.
So it feels, I'll come to the process of writing the book, because you two still seem friends after 5 years. But what did you learn in the 5 years of writing the book across time, across subjects? What about the Indian economy was surprised you, or you learned?
So I'll give two surprises, and Devesh will give two surprises. Okay. So I've spent a lot of my life writing about Indian economic growth, performance of the states, etc., etc. So one of the things that really surprised Devesh and me is the following statistic. We say, oh my God, why can't we be like China? But it turns out from 1980 to today, exactly the duration of the Chinese economic miracle, 1/3 of India grew almost as fast as China and for as long as China. So think about it. So when people say, oh, we should be like China, and these are basically, remember, the southern states, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Haryana. So, so the question of why can't we be more like China suddenly becomes, no, why can't the 2/3 of India become more like the 1/3 of India, which is actually China? So that's one thing that absolutely stunned us. The other thing that surprised me, and I don't want to blame Devesh for this, is I'm also kind of pretend to be a macroeconomist, right? I've been at the IMF. But I discovered that between 1990 and today, the period when India grew very rapidly, and when you grow rapidly, taxes do well, etc., etc. But we discovered that over this period, amongst major emerging market countries, the country with the highest fiscal deficit, almost approaching double digit every year, is India. And so, so once you have these two kinds of facts there, as it were, then, one of the things which is kind of process related, we very strongly believe that the book, we would let the data drive the argument, and these were surprises that then led us to modify our arguments.
What were your two surprises?
I think the one thing that really took us aback was just how costly state-owned enterprises have been for the country. We, for the first time, and we are pretty confident of this, we put together data over half a century of the balance sheets of central public sector enterprises. The state-owned enterprises, we could not because they are so terrible that you don't even have accounts of many of them. But we did that for ones which there were, which is the state electricity boards. The sheer hemorrhaging of these firms for more than half a century cost the country between 1.5% and 2.5% of GDP every year.
Growth rate or GDP?
GDP.
Convert that into what?
So if you, for instance, look at the opportunity, India's states could have doubled their expenditures on health if they had met even minimum standards of rates of return.
Every year, doubled it every year.
Every year. The central government could have almost increased expenditure on physical infrastructure by 75% every year for 50 years. Now, the second thing is the government was completely aware of not exactly these numbers, but the performance. The second surprise was how much the Indian state, we put together 3,000 official government reports over 60 years. The Indian state was remarkably self-reflective. Indeed, it was also quite self-flagellating. It wasn't self-congratulatory on many things, but it was rarely self-correcting. In fact, they saw the problems far more clearly than many of India's intellectuals. They were far more clear-eyed about the challenges, the mistakes, the problems. Yet the absence of self-correction, and just one thing to add here, we have this phrase which we use at the end of the book about the sort of a DNA that runs through Indian thinking society, not just in politics, but in society, which is what we call my papapism. The belief that to any problem that we have, the answer lies in the state. So, however, despite that, we almost have done nothing to reform the apparatus of the state itself. So we continue to say the state does terribly in A, B, and C. Then there's a problem, the state should do more. But we never ask the question, how should a BDO's office, a Tehsildar's office, how should it be better staffed, trained? Why are there so many vacancies? The bread and butter of organizations, and which you know so well, absolutely zero attention to that. And why?
So attention to detail.
So maybe because this is the home of DK Shiv Kumar and DK Suresh, I want to give you one more surprising fact, which I think this audience might like. So DK Suresh, I think a year ago or 2 years ago said, and he thundered this, all the GST resources that we generate are being taken away by the other states. And he kind of, it became and he kind of almost ended by saying, if this continues, kind of the threat was, we will secede kind of thing, right? So the notion in the South is that our fiscal federal arrangements lead to a large transfer of resources away from the South. So again, we put together, 75 years of data, starting from the first Finance Commission. And what you find is that it is indeed the case that large transfers take place in favor of the Hindi heartland and the East. But the surprise is the states that are the biggest quote-unquote donors are not the southern states, is in fact the western states and Haryana. And almost double, actually they contribute almost double the southern states too. So it gives a completely fresh perspective on how we should even think about fiscal federalism and whether the grievances of the South, their origin, is it only because of fiscal resources? And indeed how we should address these grievances come out because of this new data.
Can I add one more? So one other thing that somewhat surprised us was just how much violence has declined in India. So, whichever type of violence you measure, insurgencies, homicides, riots, student protests, labor strife, etc., all of them rose sharply from the mid 60s to the late 90s, early 2000s. And in the past quarter to 20 years to 25 years, have all of them, not just one of them, have fallen very sharply 70, 80, 90%. In the in the 80s, the average number of student protests was approaching 10,000 a year. When we began to look at the literature, when American political scientists in the late 50s first began to study India, their first books were all about student violence in India. Students protest all over the world. What stood out about India was how violent the protests were. And these rise to massively over the next 3 decades and then massively decline. So that now if you normalize it
You think
by
that's
the...
prosperity?
So sorry?
You think that's prosperity?
Prosperity, we don't think, we can think it's prosperity in an indirect sense. One is, in the past, most higher education students were in public institutions. Now, 60% are in private colleges. And of course, if you're paying real money, then,
Okay. Do you have an answer for why violence came down? Not really. No?
Why violence came
so
down?
we have a range of explanations, but they differ. So labor strife declines.
Okay, each one has a different
Yeah,
one.
there's no.
Okay, there's no across
one.
the board.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to push back because we need to open up to the audience. You have a line in there. The Indian state has become more illiberal, opaque, authoritarian, and majoritarian. Indian society seems to be sliding from transactional communalism to institutional bigotry. I think India is getting better. I don't think there was a golden age. I think nostalgia is usually amnesia. I don't think there was a golden age. It's usually the outgoing elite cribbing about the incoming elite. We don't weigh people, we count them. PhDs aren't worth more than normal people.
Devesh also has a PhD.
I know. So two PhD. I mean, you don't weigh people in a democracy. We count them. I think we're counting more of our people. So respond to my pushback that Indian society is sliding from transactional communism to institutional bigotry. The Indian state is more. I think India is getting better in most of the aspects most Indians care about.
I'm a boring economist. I've transferred it to the political scientist.
So look, you're absolutely right that this idea of some halcyon past,
Yes.
other than Ram Rajya, is not valid.
Yeah.
course.
Kalyug's been on for 10,000 years.
Yeah, we know that was there, but at least since the book is about independence India, we don't talk about Ram Rajya. So, but take what I said about violence. The fact that violence has declined so significantly shows you there are no halcyon. In fact, we talk about lynching. There was massive lynching in India in the 1970s. What or how was this happening? It was happening especially in Madhya Pradesh. You just have to read, this is all the National Police Commission reports, which is in 13 volumes and got buried. And it describes just how many, because Madhya Pradesh was infested by dacoity. And of course, the police had no vehicles, they didn't have wireless. It was a Sholay-like thing. The dacoits would come on horses and they would loot and kill, and the villagers, if they caught them, would just lynch them. Gradually, the state built up. It built roads. It invested in police, in weapons, in vehicles, in wireless, and gradually that violence comes down. However, just because on some aspects there's no halcyon past, doesn't mean we should not be clear-eyed that there are things that we need to be worried about what's happening now. And we firmly believe that is the case.
Yeah. So I mean, I think just to push back to the pushback, there is no denying that, institutions have weakened and become more quiescent and more,
More than the 1970s?
no, again, so it's not that it's better than, it's worse than every time in the past, but if you look at majority of our time, there were exceptions in the 70s, but certainly over the broader sweep of past history, institutions are more quiescent. The press is less free than in the past, and minority communities do feel more anxious compared to the past. I mean, you can't deny that. Now, so the question is, these things matter in themselves, but as an economist who believes that rule of law, institutions, etc., matter for the future, I think we should be very worried about these things as well. And just to give one example, Manish, I'm going to push. See, we think. Come to today. One of the challenges of today, I know the GDP numbers are great and so on, private investment has been quite weak for quite some time. Now, it's a bit of a puzzle because objectively we have macroeconomic stability, we have much better connectivity, and the banking system, the financing is all available, and yet FDI has come down and private investment has come down. Now, the question is, why is that? And is that the reason for that divorced from the broader what's happening politically? And at least my answer would be no, that some of the manifestations you see on the political side are also affecting the investment climate. To give you one example, the weaponization of the state, for example, when it's directed at some target groups, political target groups, problem, but it's also arbitrarily targeted at some investors and not other investors. And that has to take a toll on longer-run economic prospects.
I mean, if I can add to that, I've been teaching for more than 3 decades. It's only in the last 7 years, for the first time, I get Indian minority parents urging me to tell their children who I teach not to come back to India. Okay. I am part of the majority community. I obviously don't feel that. But if I don't listen to parents of my own students and their concerns, I will be blind, deaf, dumb, and I've had a lobotomy not to recognize that reality.
Okay. We'll agree to disagree. Is there anybody, questions here? I can't.
With us, and everybody reflected on it and was far more aware than the ordinary citizen about things going wrong. Why is it that we could, after having the information, we couldn't do anything about it, or states didn't do anything about it? And tomorrow, or today and tomorrow, what are we going to do when we have the information available?
You want to go ahead?
I want to say, this is not a direct answer to your question, but I want to say something about, you focused on what we did wrong and why didn't we learn the lessons. Okay, and Devesh may answer that. But I think what's been surprising and disappointing a lot about India is why haven't we learned from the successes? Why, it's like, they used to say about the Bourbons, they forget nothing and remember nothing. Just to give you one example, the most successful periods in the Indian economy were when we were more open to world trade, to world investment, etc. And yet, beginning in 2018, for example, we turned protectionist, almost ignoring the lessons of the recent past of, openness got us, better economic prospects. In fact, that is bipartisan, not learning from successes. Because if you look at the Congress Party manifestos in the last 5-10 years, they are the party that presided over much of the, not all, but much of the liberalization and the positive outcomes that resulted from it. And yet their manifestos are absolutely, do not mention the need to increase efficiency, openness, etc., etc.
You want to answer? I mean, let's go to the next one. I mean, my submission would be India's problem is not what is to be done. There's a 20-year-old report. It is how is it to be done. In the political economy, he can explain to you vested interests. I mean, it's not an engineering problem. Life is second best at best in policy. And so it's not an engineering problem. It's a hard thing to say in Bangalore. Go ahead. Yes,
I think
sir. Why don't you scream out? Okay, can't hear you. Does anybody else have a mic?
No, he has a mic.
He
yeah,
has
here's
it.
Mike.
Audible? Yeah, something to do with the foreign policy aspect of our country. So when Trump came into power, there was a sentiment that he'll be kind to us, and with all the Vishwaguru aspect that was going around. But we realized as soon as the tariff war opened that we were right up at the leaderboard. So again, tying it back to what Manish said, not learning from our mistakes. Do you think that aspect changing, in the coming years? That we learn from these mistakes, that we try to assume that the other countries will be kind to us, and generally with respect to our capacity to react to these kind of measures that are taken on us.
Are you saying we're particularly dyslexic or we have a learning disability? Because cultural explanations for poverty are at best the soft bigotry of low expectations, and at worst they are racism, right? The Hindu rate of growth went from 2% to 7% without shooting the Hindus. So clearly there was another problem. We had a plumbing problem, we had a license Raj problem, we had many issues. So I mean, this particular learning disability that is coming up, I'd love for you to take that from a political economy or from an economist's perspective.
No, I mean, just on on that small question around foreign policy and the misplaced expectations about how Trump would treat India, etc. I mean, in some ways, I would argue he's done India a favor. I mean, India does not change because good people sit down and say this is the optimal policy and we change. We often change when we get a good kick, like from the behind. And that
So
happened.
compulsion.
It's compulsion. It's
Not
67,
conviction.
91. And you do see reforms happening in the past 3-4 months, which frankly had been much, much slower in the previous 6 years. So to that extent, one should say, just as Johnson, by withholding wheat shipments to India when India had this terrible famines, really made India change its agricultural policy, just as we had to ship out gold to save our sort of, not to have a debt, default, led to the 91 reforms. In some ways, that way, it's a wake-up call that, look, you have a neighbor to your north who's growing way too powerful. You thought you could have strong relations to balance that neighbor. You have to rely much more on yourself. And to do that, you have to make changes much faster just to keep still.
No, but I want to, not end with a counsel of despair on change, for example, right? So we changed because of crises in the past, we've mentioned. We've also changed because of technology. The whole telecom revolution happened, but then you could say that too is exogenous. But the biggest driver of change in India was economic growth itself. Growth did change our economy in so many ways. Even our educational improvements happened a lot because, resources became available, and the returns to education went up because then parents said, we must push our kids. But I think the most hopeful way I think change can come about is what I would call, the logic of a competitive federalism and the examples from within. For example, take, the power sector, for example, very complicated. But there are examples in India like Gujarat, which have done this, and therefore other states can do it. So learning by imitation, not from 10,000 mile away neighbors, but from our neighbors in other states.
The 2/3, 1/3.
Yeah, the
learning.
2/3 could be a powerful agent for change.
Yes, ma'am. Last question. I just want you.
My question is about the data that you relied on. We've had a lot of issues, particularly with data coming out of the NSO or our GDP numbers or census. Some of it is outdated, some of it is unreliable. And because the book is primarily analyzing this data around India, where we've had these issues that often get co-opted into political narrative, how did you kind of go about ensuring that the data that you've put in, to the best of your ability, was, good to go?
So one of the things, these data issues are also a bit more recent, the ones you're talking about.
Exactly, yeah.
We put together data over 7 decades, and it's true, to be consistent, we have relied on government, or official government data, because there are no alternatives when you look at the long run. with, of course, trying to triangulate it with where possible data from, say, the IMF on macro numbers or the World Bank. It's true that, and we do have caveats about growth numbers, etc., over the past decades, and Arvind can talk more about that.
I want to end on a more kind of literary note on the data, or on the whole GDP stuff. So as Devesh rightly said, historically we use historical data, which is not prone to it. The more recent data we show are kind of problematic, and we signal wherever there is, and we try and cross-check it through many ways. But on the GDP data itself, one of the funny things is that there have been episodes of overestimation, and there are episodes of underestimation of GDP growth. So the line in the book is that India's statistical, Arthur C. Clarke used to say, every sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And we say that the Indian system is a bit like that magic, but in the following sense: it can conjure up GDP, but it can also make GDP disappear. So the dark art of disappearing and the positive art of conjuring it up, our GDP system has seen that in the last 20 years symmetrically.
Great, thank you very much. It's a fantastic book. I hope all of you will read it. There were two very smart people who we wave because they're PhDs, and they've done a wonderful job.
Clearly someone has PhD envy here.